Great. Well, welcome everyone. We will now get started on our next panel. It is quite a broad topic, right? The title itself is a longest. So energy demand, renewable shares, investment necessary to drive a low carbon economy. For such a wide topic, I'm joined with three experts in very different fields, as you will see. And the goal of today's presentation is really mapping, especially from a US resource-based perspective, the transition from today's need for energy, which is mostly shale, oil, and gas, and then seeing how that transitions over time with renewables on power generation, but also storage, as that becomes an increasingly necessary component of the renewable build-out. And one of the unique features of the panel is we'll also look at the financing side, right? One of the elements I mentioned this morning, what we're very focused at in our research at Goldman Sachs is the uncertainty that has exploded on the energy transition, right? So it's, of course, the demand for energy with COVID, the dramatic fall in mobility and increase in power demand. It is, how much oil really should be a part of the future mix. And then as you add ESG policies, really where is that capital coming? If everyone excludes oil and gas from their investment, then we just end up with today's shortages. So, we will have an investment component to this discussion. Joining me today on the panel, you have Rick Clark from NextEra. So that will be the renewable with a view on hydrogen as well for the storage side. Joined by John Holbrook from TCU University. So that will be expertise from a geologist, and especially we'll discuss geothermal. And then finally, Adam Frost, SVP at the Export-Import Bank of the United States. So let me start off with me turning to Rick. If Rick, you could present yourself and your key focus here.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to talk today. My name is Rick Clark. I work for NextEra Energy in Juno Beach, Florida. And NextEra has kind of two fundamental main companies, right? One is Florida Power and Light, rate-regulated utility in the state of Florida, dominated by natural gas generation, something like 20 gigawatts of generation there. And then we have our 30 by 30 plan, right, which is to install 30 million solar panels in Florida by 2030, and we're really quite ahead of schedule on that, and that's an exciting opportunity for the Sunshine State. In addition, we own NextEra Energy Resources, right? That's kind of our national wholesale renewables-focused generation company. We've got wind, solar, and storage are the fundamental things we do. A big part of my job is to think about technology innovation and actually what are the solutions to continue to improve the affordability of those resources, wind, solar, and batteries. NextEra has had tremendous evolution in our wind technology over the last 5 or 7 years that I've been with NextEra. When I started in 2015, we were installing turbines with about 90-meter rotor diameters. Now we're installing turbines that are 140-meter rotor diameters, right? And so that means you can produce the same generation with many fewer poles in the ground. And you think about the generation is connected to the swept area, right? So 90 to 140, it's almost 4 times more energy per wind turbine just in a span of 7 years, and that manifests in lower costs. That same type of cost evolution has also happened with solar. Solar panels are down by something like 80 or 90% in cost over the last decade, and in addition to that, the core efficiency of the solar module, how much electricity you get from it, is continuing to improve. A great example is about 3 years ago, the industry adopted bifacial solar modules, right, which provide incremental about 5 or 8% more energy from generation on the backside that simply wasn't there before, right? So the increasing affordability of these technologies over the past decade has been really enabling for NextEra. And the last part I'll comment on, right, our core business is batteries, right? So actually in 2021, NextEra invested $1 billion in batteries, both in the state of California, Florida, other places. Those batteries are supporting the duck curve and doing so kind of in an economic way, aligned with market prices in the CAISO. And then we were able to install the world's largest solar-powered battery in Manatee, Florida this year, a 409 megawatt, 2.2-hour battery. When we think about deep decarbonization, wind, solar, and storage will be key workhorses as part of that future solution. for a zero emissions future. But another dimension of it could be hydrogen. NextEra is expanding our investment in hydrogen. This year, we announced the Okeechobee Clean Energy Center will have on-site solar, use a green electrolyzer to produce hydrogen, store that as gaseous hydrogen, and then inject it after the sun goes down into a combined cycle gas turbine as a blend with natural gas and incrementally reduce the carbon intensity. Really a learning exercise, but it will be one of the largest electrolyzers in America, about $65 million investment that Florida Power & Light is doing there. So, beyond that, I spent time thinking about other implications for hydrogen, right? Hydrogen for the power sector is a helpful tool for that last little bit of decarbonization relative to installing, curtailed or surplus solar or more batteries or something like that, right? But in addition, right, hydrogen can be really helpful as a bridge to decarbonize the power, things beyond the power sector, right? Applications like ammonia synthesis, synthetic fuels, even synthetic natural gas, right? So that's me.
Great. Thanks, Rick. John?
All right. First off, let me introduce myself. I'm a professor here at TCU. My name is John Holbrook, and I teach over in the geology program. But of course, like most all of us who are here, I have a pretty big area of research and a bunch of graduate students and publish and get grants and all the stuff that academics do. And so in my overall expertise, specifically, I study the subsurface of the earth. I fundamentally would say I'm a plumber. Okay, so basically you want to put something in the ground or you want to get something out of it, you hire one of my students. And because they're the ones who tell you where the shales are, the sands are, and all the good stuff where you're going to pump water through, or if you're trying to get something out or keep something from getting in, we do that. So we end up sort of being the soybeans of a lot of the industry, something that you know is there, but you don't necessarily eat it on its own. So what that means for us then is that it means that it leaves me a lot of chance to have a total ADHD career and dabble in a lot of things. So obviously, one thing I do is there are a population of us as professors who fundamentally serve that role as to turn out oil hunters. The people on the very, very front end who do the exploration and the basic production work and all that front end stuff that goes to the engineers to produce it, but we're the tip of the spear in terms of the oil industry. And along with that, my area is largely fundamental research in that area. So I'm way upstream in this system. And so that's part of what I do. Oddly enough, there's only about 200 to 300 of us in the country if you stop and think about it and run the numbers. So there's less of us doing this than you might think. But it means that I've got students at Chevron, I've got students at Finley, I've got students at BlackRock, I've got students just all over the place, infiltrating companies all over, doing petroleum type work and also working in the finance end of it as well. The other thing though is that everybody needs a plumber, so I also work on the end of trying to keep stuff out of the ground. So I've done a lot of expert witness work and so forth for Superfund sites and so forth on the environmental end. Then on the other side of it, of course, as Damien was pointing out, I devoted about 10 years of my life to running the National Science Foundation's geothermal research program. So I was the head of something called SED-HEAT, that was geared towards trying to get to the fundamental science to improve our ability to produce geothermal energy from sedimentary basins. So I was chief cook and bottle watcher, which basically meant I'm trying to get a bunch of engineers and social science and finance people and geologists to all talk together to try to come up with ideas to move that ball forward. And so I did that for quite a while. And of course, the other thing that I do is one of my fundamental research areas is in paleoclimate. I study the Earth's recent and sometimes deeper time, how the climate operates on Earth over long periods and how the Earth responds. And that's where a lot of my actual academic publications are. Okay, so I'll leave that as an introduction.
It's a tough act to follow, both of them, so I apologize. Hey, everybody. My name is Adam Frost. I just have to compliment TCU for this conference. I'm a senior vice president at the Export-Import Bank, and the next question I always get is, what is that, and what does it mean? So I look forward to, if you're having trouble sleeping tonight, you can call me. I can go on about it for a few hours if you need to have trouble talking about the export finance world. However, we are the U.S. government's export credit agency. We are it. We are the only one that works for the federal government. So thank you to TCU for getting me out of Washington for at least 24 hours and getting me down to Texas. The weather is much better, and the company is fantastic. So what I thought I'd do is I'd tell you a little bit about kind of what we do. So we're an export credit agency, which means that our mission is to support U.S. jobs through exports, right? And typically what that means is that we're on the debt side. So we have short-term loans and insurance products. We have medium-term and long-term debt products that help U.S. exporters. If, for whatever reason, the commercial sector isn't able to take on the project, we're the ones that come in and add some additionality to it. So what I mean by that, for EXIM to play a role, there's got to sort of be three things coming together overall. You have to have a demand for U.S. goods, which means or services. An American is selling something, and a not American is buying it, right? You got to have what we would call you have to have a certain degree of American content in it, but you have to have this concept of additionality, which basically means that for any number of reasons, the commercial banking industry isn't going to take it. Tenors are too long, their exposure to that client's too much, any number of reasons that they're not quite there to do it. Right, but there has to be reasonable assurance of repayment. We are not a grant organization, we are not an aid organization, we are a bank. And so it has to be bankable. And the reason that's so important is because that's sort of America's way of doing this, right? We do not play the game the way others interact. Because the reason I'm here is that I think, without jumping into countless policy arguments and discussions, I think it is very clear that the United States is in a competition for the 21st century with the People's Republic of China and other countries. And I'd say as we're having this discussion about the energy transition, that is a big part of it, from everything from the renewable energy space and the regular traditional products that provide energy and power and electricity, all the way upstream into the critical minerals, et cetera, that help support the technologies of tomorrow. So we are in a competition for this industry. Now, the other thing we believe here at EXIM is that it's American workers and American businesses that are going to win that competition. And what I'm making is not a political statement, but a structural one, in the sense that it is in the U.S. political economy, the government cannot direct. Even if you love everything that the Chinese are doing, which I do not, but even if you wanted this idea to say, if I only had the greatest industrial policy, people look at them and they say, I need some of that. I need some central direction. I need some direction of capital. Even if you wanted to do that, the plumbing does not exist in the United States to do it. The federal branch of the executive branch of the federal government cannot physically implement those wonderful ideas. Which is a way of saying it is the businesses in this room, it is the students in this room that go on to those businesses that are the ones that are actually going to win this competition. And at EXIM, we also believe that it is exports are a tool to help you win, right? Because we know from countless years of study, right, that exporting actually grows revenue for businesses, it makes you more competitive, it grows your business plans. It's 100 different values that grow American jobs right here. And in this competition, we are very adamant that the economic benefits that can come from the transition, as well as the economic benefits that come from exporting, should come back here to the United States and grow American jobs and grow out our economy. But the problem is when the playing field isn't level, you can't do it on your own. So to give you an example, just some boring stats, 2019, year before COVID, first year my bank was reauthorized after we were closed down for a little while. US government in total did about $5.1 billion in export credits. People's Republic of China did 33. All right, that means when people talk about One Belt, One Road, they talk about the activities of the PRC overseas. The export financing, that's just official, by the way. That's what we can find and count from medium and long-term official, not counting the policy banks and all the semi-private banks. That is the lubricant that is allowing all these things to happen, right? They finance foreign buyers to buy Chinese goods and services. In 2020, the year of COVID, right, where huge declines, the US did about 1.4, 1.8 in export credits. Chinese did 18, right? So even in these depressed periods, for those of you who are trying to break into the export world, the scales are against you in a way that is not fair. So what's new at EXIM is that when we were reauthorized in late 2019, your elected representatives told us we have to get in the game, right? So they made us stand up programs, et cetera, to more effectively compete against the People's Republic of China, which I'm happy to go in depth overall in time. But my message is really here for the group, so in order to get off the stage and have a little bit of dialogue, is fundamentally we need you, right? This dialogue, and I mean this to TCU, I mean this to the students and the businesses, everyone in here, we need you. Because the thinking and if anybody tells you they have solutions to the transition problem or they have solutions for what the government should do or the private business should do, I think they're making it up. I don't think we have an answer. I think only forums like this are the types of places where those answers start to emerge in our very American way. And if I can help in any way, it's to push the conversation a little bit towards not just the transition within the United States or what's happening in Russia or what's happening in the PRC, but how could exports help grow the businesses and grow the prosperity here in the US in a way that make us more competitive, that drive down costs, that give you benefit in supply chain financing, et cetera, right? So we have an interest in helping to push that conversation that way. And my last thing I'll say, just for the students in the room, my only payment for services rendered is we do have an internship program, and it is in a distance world, we're willing to entertain and I work with you to do remote internships. So with that, I'll do that little plug before I get mobbed for internships in the fall semester.
Thanks, Adam. So one key area I want to pick up on is exactly the export channel, right? Because what the U.S. can do in the short run is really through shale. And right, keep in mind, if you look at the oil market, this is the longest and largest deficit since we have data. Inventories, as we measure them, are near record low. OPEC spare capacity itself is near record low, right? So the solution is short cycle. I mentioned that this morning. It's not only the solution in the context of uncertainty, but just in today's need for molecules. So I'm going to pick up where actually the last panel left, and that was a question, I believe, to Dean, which is, okay, well, how big is that shale resource, right? So I'll turn to our geologist, John. Is there indeed a core that we're depleting, or is this an issue? Are we back in the 2008 framework where we're really worried about where energy will come from out of the ground?
Right. Well, there's a couple ways to look at it. As was brought up before, resources, when we talk about them as a geologist, we talk about how much is actually there on the planet. And the answer is no. The human race has burned about 10 trillion barrels of oil so far, and we use a bit of gas. We use about 3.9. We lose a lot. But the thing of it is that when you start talking about how much oil is in shales, there's probably about 10 trillion barrels of oil equivalent in just North America. It's dispersed, and it's hard to get to. And so what happens is we figure we got about 50 years worth of the cream. That's existing technologies and existing prices in the world. That's about it. But the reality is, if you ask the bigger question, if you're willing to spend more as technology increases, as we learn things, is it there? Oh gosh, that's not, running out of that isn't the problem. We don't run out of it for centuries. But just as a case in point of how this works, though, for instance, I had a student. He was a TCU grad, and he works for Finley now. And I guess I'm not giving away secrets on him anymore, but he worked with me just studying these little thin beds of sand in the middles of these shale units. And that seems a little academic at first, but we did some fundamental research. It was funded by some oil companies because they were curious. We got in there, he did his thesis. He goes and works in the Green River. There's about 5 trillion barrels in the Green River Uinta Basin. It's a lot of oil in there, and of course gas as well. And so what he did was he was drilling, and he was in charge of that field, and he looked at it and he realized, hey, I know those little thin sands. I've seen those. I studied those things. Those things tap to bigger things. Well, they've been bypassing them. So he started perfing them. Company increased production 600%. Okay. That's what we do in basic research, right? And then that's an example of someone who took it and applied it. That's a never-ending story. That's what brought us shale gas in the first place, is little technology breakthroughs. And so what it amounts to is not seeing the future and not knowing what crazy ideas we're going to come up with next. You can't predict what we might be able to get out of those shales in the future. All you can look at and say is knowing what we know at current prices. Yeah, about 50 years.
Now, we've seen a pivot recently with much greater focus on gas and LNG, right? The U.S. Administration was in Europe last Friday committing to more exports. And So is that same for the shale gas resource? I mean, it's even larger, right?
What do you mean now?
Shale gas.
Yes. Yeah, so no, shale gas is, shale gas, I think that we estimate China has about 10 years worth of it in existing reserves. We've got about 6 if we were having to run the world by ourselves. So of that patch, that's kind of it. So the thing is that if you start talking about turning it into LNG, we've got plenty enough to export. The industry has suffered quite a lot because we've got just laterals waiting to go in and just people who can't wait to drill them. And we've got a load of that resource that's out there that's untapped that we could tap. It would take us time to ramp up to that. But yeah, at this point in time, I think there was something like 6 LNG facilities are waiting in the government to get licensed. We could ramp it up pretty fast. So I'm not worried too much about us being able to export large amounts of LNG and take a tremendous load off of the world. The reality of it is it would take us a little time, even if we just said go. We'd be the better part of the year probably getting that ramped up and actually in place. But yeah, there's not a real problem there. Plus the other problem is that, as I said, these shale issues, we're tapping the easy stuff right now. Once you tap the easy stuff, you look at something like the Marcellus, it's the majority producer right now. But it's one shale in Pennsylvania that's part of a bigger Devonian shale that goes down to Tennessee, where they call it the Chattanooga Shale in Chattanooga. And it's the Ohio Shale, and it's the Berea. And it covers all the way from New York all the way down to Tennessee, and we're tapping that. It's just that it's not as rich in other places, so you see those leases are sitting there waiting, but they're there.
Which, I think the point on having to build that export capacity is essential, right? If you look at, there are about 8 LNG projects sitting at the FERC waiting for approval. And what's missing as well for those projects is offtake commitments, right? So that was one of the key points in that Friday announcement is, okay, the U.S. can help in the short run divert some LNG to Europe. But really, to make a difference, you now need to see European utilities commit to buying U.S. LNG, right? Those projects only get financed if they have a big enough offtake capacity. So maybe I'll turn to Adam there, right? This is an export of U.S. molecules, so it helps labor somewhat indirectly. But how does Exim in particular, for example, help get that end user building out the project that is needed to import the LNG?
No, absolutely. So the assumption always being that for a certain reason the commercial sector isn't going to take it. It's too rich, too risky, not going to take the deal entirely. Exim's got a couple products that I think would help in this sort of a situation. So we're very good at project finance, right? So if you want to build a new receiving LNG terminal in Europe or someplace else, right, then this is multi-year. But sometimes it's difficult, particularly after Basel II, for some of the commercial sector to take that kind of a risk. You're talking about 18 years with these kind of volatile prices people are talking about. Why would I want to take that sort of risk? That's where Exim comes in with what we would call guarantees. So we can do loans or direct loans or guarantees with sovereign governments or with commercial entities, right? Where we can just buy down that risk just a little bit, particularly with the guarantee products, so that your commercial bank, if you're comfortable working with them, you like Goldman Sachs, I hear they're the finest, particularly at moderating. They're a fantastic, Exim will quietly be in the background helping to underwrite and guarantee that loan just to encourage the private sector just a little bit to take the risk, but it's still got to be bankable, right? So you have the project finance side, if you're on that side, and then also there's medium and short-term projects where if people are exporting LNG, as Scott Baum was saying earlier, right, the questions and the issues you all are dealing with on a day-to-day basis do have national security and foreign policy implications. And we've heard a lot of the statements about the Europeans wanting to talk about importing U.S. LNG, particularly in the short term, if there is a need for a facilitation of some kind with medium or long-term debt products. Absolutely. Because one thing I'll add, I always get asked this question. Structurally, actually, our elected representatives were very smart. You have lots of policy organizations that are run by whichever party's in charge, but the actual lending arms, the banks, are actually independent government agencies. So while we have a board of 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and somebody that's appointed by whichever party has the White House, it's confirmed by the Senate, but we are independent of the other cabinet agencies, and they made sure, because you don't want the guys with the money doing exactly what the elected guys say all the time, right? So the risk is on our board, and they made very clear that we are not allowed to discriminate on any industry. Right? So if it's a creditworthy deal, we have to take a look at it.
Actually, but last August, the U.S. Treasury guided the development banks like the World Bank to stop funding fossil fuel. And that's big because it's, in 2019, that's $16 billion of funding just for gas and LNG alone. So what you just said, though, is Exim would not be then limited by such restrictions.
That's correct. So I got to walk as a civil servant, I have to walk a fine line here. All right, so everybody bear with me and don't tweet about me, right? But the truth is that obviously, like, bank fully supports the shift to renewables and working through the transition, but we are an independent government agency, and by law, we are not allowed to discriminate. So, no, we're sorry. That was not popular when we had to point that out to the powers that be.
Yeah, and I mean, you did mention, though, that you had a few areas of key focus in terms of the energy transition, right? So there is, though, a pivot maybe to on the funding side, or at least in considering more projects.
Oh, absolutely. We are my boss has lit a fire under us. We are highly incentivized to support anything that works in the areas of renewable energy, energy storage, and energy efficiency. And so I am highly incentivized by not getting yelled at to find and bring in deals, right, that help U.S. exporters. And so our hypothesis is that if exporting does help grow industries and make you bigger, and if one of the problems you face is that you're getting undercut by the People's Republic of China, you can't win that bid because they're bringing in, you can't win that solar bid, you can't win that hydrogen bid or that wind bid because they are undercutting sales, and I could go through the statistics of how they're crushing us on exports, and they're using those exports to drive their own internal transition. It's not just the government money, right? Our job is to help you fight back.
Okay, well, since we approached renewables, I'll bring in Rick here. I mean, NextEra has aggressively developed projects on the renewable side. We heard it briefly at the end of the previous panel. I mean, does it just come down to low levelized cost of electricity? Is that, in the end, what's made renewables so competitive?
I think that's a really important factor, right? That the renewables, have gone down in cost dramatically, right? And we're still at a point where the level of renewable penetration in many parts of this country is low enough that incremental generation for renewables manifests in reduced consumption of coal or oil or natural gas, right? Just to connect, though, to the export point, I do think that there are some exciting opportunities down the road where even renewables can support things like providing energy to Germany, for example, right? By using renewable electricity to create hydrogen, there's an opportunity to have now a physical commodity derived from renewable electricity, a zero emissions product, and then to turn that into an exportable commodity like ammonia or synthetic natural gas or liquid hydrogen. And I think we saw even just this week there was a big announcement between an Australian company and E.ON, I think it is, right, for bringing large quantities of liquid hydrogen to Germany derived from renewable electricity. So I think the affordability of renewable electricity has been a big part of how it's established a foothold kind of in the electric sector, right? But now there's kind of a new emerging opportunity, whereas that renewables gets even lower priced to actually turn it into a physical commodity and participate in international markets and export.
Now, for now, you remain a big importer of the basic pieces of renewable, and we're seeing a surge in costs, right? So there are the frictions in trade with China. We have much higher wage costs in the U.S. We're seeing steel shortages across industries. Is that trying to impact that advantage of renewable, or is it still, from an LCOE perspective, so that levelized cost metric, still inframarginal to natural gas, for example?
Yeah, I think like a lot of other industries, right, there has been impact from labor inflation and commodity price increases. I think the one thing I think that renewables maybe has going for it is, as has been talked about earlier today multiple times, there's this overriding kind of technology innovation that's happening. And so, the effect of those commodity price impacts, for example, can be muted partially because, hey, we've got innovation that's happening where the product already was going to be 10% cheaper than it was last year. Hey, if we've got a 10% cost increase, it manifests in customers as more like a flat or a slower reduction than otherwise would be manifest.
So one aspect that's come up on the renewable side is, if you look at California, if you look at the UK last September, the intermittency is becoming at times problematic, right? So you had no wind in the UK in September for 10 days, and they had blackouts. So, that brings in storage. Are we at the point where without sufficient large-scale storage, renewable penetration will slow?
So obviously, right, there's going to be a lot of market-by-market variability there, right, happening in California now, but a lot of other markets, right, maybe it's not an issue. Clearly, the inclusion of storage increases the cost of renewables, right, to mitigate that intermittency. NextEra and a lot of other companies, I think, are trying to work to reduce that cost. And just some examples I can share, legacy battery investments have really been applications of automotive technology. But automotive batteries have to do a lot of things that stationary grid batteries don't have to do, right? Like you have to move an automobile battery from one place to another, right? Or you have to have a very fast charging capability, right? So I think there's a movement in this space to think about differentiated batteries that are really meant for the stationary storage application and can be lower cost to improve the affordability of shoring up those renewables. And I do think there's an important role that will be played by other non-battery technologies, right? We've talked about hydrogen and storage of hydrogen either as ammonia or in subsurface caverns, or other innovative technologies, maybe like geothermal, for example. One, I think, new innovation that's happening with geothermal is trying to inject more of the return water during the daytime when the solar is out, right? And then when the sun goes down, you've got a higher pressure in that geothermal cavity, and you're able to bring that up and actually have some level of dispatchability, not just base load, right? So that's an example of emerging, in fact, non-battery solution for mitigating the intermittency of renewables.
So if I get more specific though, do you have battery technology at sufficient scale today that you can actually develop a project that is solar plus battery to create a steadier source of electricity? Or are we still at the early stages there?
So the automotive sector, right, is a much bigger consumer of batteries and will be than the stationary market, at least for now. I think the battery applications that have been done so far have been focusing on the highest value dispatch periods, right? So it's not necessarily taking a solar plant that makes power for 10 hours a day and turning that into a continuous base generation asset, right? Instead, in a place like California, right, I think we installed about 2 gigawatt hours of batteries in California in 2021. Those batteries are used almost exclusively for the daily charge-discharge cycle of charge at 10 a.m. until 3 p.m., and then the sun goes down. We've got this duck curve issue. Batteries have immediate instant response, and they're dispatched from, say, 6 p.m. when the sun goes down to 10 p.m., and now we can have the combined cycles or whatever else it is come on in a controlled and well-understood fashion, right? So California is actively continuing those battery procurements and solving that problem first, which will be the least expensive to do, and then deeper decarbonization will take more expense, right? More larger batteries or alternate technologies.
And that's where hydrogen comes in then.
That's right. So hydrogen, right, is great. So batteries fundamentally have this property where if you want to have a battery discharge for twice as long, it costs twice as much, right? You have to buy like another battery, right? And so that kind of linear scaling with batteries makes them expensive for long duration applications. When you instead use, for example, an electrolyzer to convert electricity, surplus electricity into hydrogen, incremental storage of that hydrogen, you don't have to buy a bigger electrolyzer, you just need bigger tanks or you need a bigger subsurface cavern. And incremental cost of tanks for longer duration is much smaller than the cost of buying a whole new darn battery system, right? So hydrogen is really going to play a complementary role to batteries for this type of energy storage application. Batteries will be that shorter duration, kind of daily workhorse, maybe aligned with the sun going up, sun going down, right? And then hydrogen will be the long duration application to fill in the gaps, right, when there is that kind of renewable intermittency like you talked about in the United Kingdom. And again, that's not going to be the entirety of the solution, right? There'll be other resources. And the last thing I would add is just that there'll be regional differences, right? The availability of low-cost green hydrogen is dependent on the availability of low-cost renewable energy. Well, that's easier to do in, say, Texas than it is to do in Vermont. Excuse me. So, the geographic diversity of renewable resource will manifest in what is the lowest cost solution for deep decarbonization.
And so the U.S. has an advantage here on the hydrogen generation side because of maybe renewable potential?
I think that's exactly right. You look globally, right, and I'm much more focused on the U.S., right, but places like the Middle East, North Africa, Australia, and the United States, they're going to be extremely well suited for renewable energy. And I think about export opportunities. we do think of hydrogen as something that you can take, U.S. wind and solar and put it in a bottle and export a zero emissions product, which in some markets like Europe, for example, they're assigning very high value to the low emissions attributes, and so those can be commercially advantageous, right? Other technologies I'm excited about include methane pyrolysis, turning natural gas into carbon black and hydrogen, and now you've got, it's still a zero emissions hydrogen product, but it's derived from carbon black, again, could be well suited for export.
And if I could pile on top of that, I mean, we're also bullish on hydrogen over at XM. I mean, some estimates are job growth of up to 700,000 in the hydrogen business over the next couple of years, but in the competition with the PRC, it's actually a bright spot. We have 1.4 times the storage capacity. Even though I think the PRC does produce more hydrogen domestically than we do, by volume, that I'll defer to the experts on. We've got 1.4 times the storage capacity, and though international trade is small, our international exports in hydrogen are 8 times theirs. So if there's market opportunity to seize that terrain, I would love it if the United States was able to do it.
Eric, just last point on hydrogen. What's the timeline for scalability?
Yeah, so the key thing with hydrogen, really, I mean, you got to think about it as different sectors, right? So it's not, there's industrial applications, there's power, and there's automotive or transport, right? I think industrial will be relatively, the first one. There'll be people who have a willingness to pay in other sectors. The key enabler, though, for a reduction in the price of green hydrogen is a reduction in the price of electrolyzers. And electrolyzer is that device that converts, renewable electricity to hydrogen. Right now, those devices are expensive, and they require high utilization for the hydrogen to be economic, even during times necessarily where the renewable power is not necessarily cheap, right? As electrolyzers come down in price, then you can afford to run them just for those hours where the renewable electricity is free or abundant or very low price, right? And so now you've got the double whammy, right? A low-cost capital asset being powered by low-cost renewables. That will be a key gateway to drive down the price of green hydrogen. When is that happening? Well, one answer is when the scale of electrolyzer production goes up. And a great mechanism to accelerate the pace of electrolyzer manufacturing might be, for example, the hydrogen production tax credit that was included in the Build Back Better bill as passed by the House. We broadly think that there's bipartisan support for that, and that'd be a major accelerant. In the absence of that, right, I think people widely say that green hydrogen will be competitive in the early 2030s, right, with gray hydrogen as an example, right? That happens sooner if there's appropriate incentives.
Which brings 2 points, right? The first one is how government, through certain tax credits in particular, can achieve what you could elsewhere achieve through a carbon tax, for example, which is help subsidize some technologies. Now, one area of tax credit in the U.S. has been the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture. And the timeline you mentioned is the second reason that I think one should think about carbon capture a lot more. The state of the world is we still consume a lot of hydrocarbon. It's oil, it's gas, it's coal. And the issue of all those emissions is the CO2 content in the air. So when you think about the timeline that is still 7-8 years to scalable hydrogen, for example, and to limitations on utility scale batteries, then it makes the potential for carbon capture to be a key component of the energy transition. As was stated on the panel previously, apart from nuclear, there's nothing more efficient from an energy density than oil, right? You think about a tanker, a VLCC, a cruise line, there's nothing more efficient than fuel oil to put the energy in and travel. You take LNG, it takes a lot more space, batteries, the ship will sink. And so in the end, that creates, even beyond the next 10, 20 years, a likely long tailwind for the use of oil as a means of transporting energy. So that brings up carbon capture. We think that's probably a under-invested area. Now, it is expensive, but the US and probably the Middle East, from our perspective, have that potential significant capture opportunity because of the large onshore reservoirs, existing infrastructure as well. So let me turn it back to John. I mean, you're the expert at what's underground. So, we take out the oil. What's the outlook for the sequestration?
The issue always with sequestration is largely in the capture. I mean, we've been looking at how to put things in the ground and take things out of the ground for a long time. So putting the carbon into the ground is not really our problem. The problem is actually getting the carbon that's the problem to the site to inject it and the energy to actually get the job done. So obviously it's not a perpetual motion machine. You don't want to get in a position where you're making more carbon, putting the carbon into the ground. So getting the efficiency of the capture and then getting the efficiency of putting it in the ground is really sort of the economic problem and practical. As far as getting it in the ground and getting it to stay there, well, that's what we do for a living. We work out those sorts of things. There's bugs in there that you're like, well, some of them might leak a little more, some of them might do a little better. Well, that's not a thing where you say, well, this won't work for that. It's like, well, no, it's more like oil and gas. You look for it, and you study the subsurface, and you say, that's a better reservoir than that one. So we've got no problem getting it in the ground and getting it to stay there. It just means that there's a lot of people, it puts a lot of my students to work. But I would also say along those lines, though, that the other thing to bear in mind about that is we do have some experience in disposal. We've been storing wastewater underground for a long time in huge volumes, but you also have seen there are other side effects of that. We had a lot of rumbling here in Dallas-Fort Worth because we had injection wells that were going at like 20,000 barrels a day, and they were overpressuring the subsurface. So there are intricacies to this, but they're overcomable.
Now, so we talked about taking oil out, putting CO2 back in. So now let's get to geothermal. Right?
Okay.
So you mentioned to me, and I discovered a lot from our conversation earlier this week, just the vast potential of geothermal. We talk about shale basins in the U.S. potentially being large, but you're describing that geothermal opportunity is even larger.
Yeah, and like I say, we spent a lot of years talking to a lot of people, and we saw geothermal evolve quite a lot. I jokingly say where we went to over 10 years with geothermal is maybe for dollars to certainly for pennies. We can do it. The problem with geothermal, there's a couple hurdles to geothermal, but there's some good sides to it. First off, there's 3 fundamental ways you can use it. Obviously, one of them is direct heat. Close to a quarter of the energy that we use in this country is just heating and cooling this room. And all of our industrial sites, those are operated at temperatures that geothermal waters always are very accessible geothermal waters in sedimentary basins are already at. So that requires infrastructure, that requires steam tunnels and all that good stuff that you use on a college campus, but you often don't use everywhere else. So a lot of the places that are going towards this are places like college campuses, where they have a lot of buildings, steam tunnels, controlled infrastructure, the institutional. So as an example, I was talking to one of my buddies, Tim Kearns. He's my equivalent at University of West Virginia. And he was telling me about a year ago how that the University of West Virginia got this big grant, just fell in the lap. Nobody even asked for it. Just boom, here's a big grant to drill some deep wells to bring up hot water to use geothermal to heat and cool the campus. Apparently, he said they have a powerful senator. But anyway, the thing is a few people got that mansion. But anyway, thing of it is that there's campuses that are doing this. Cornell's on it, Indiana's on it, and even much of the buildings here are on local geothermal. So that's one avenue. The other avenue to take with geothermal is, well, again, that falls into the electron saved as electron earned. If you aren't using that energy as electricity to heat and cool the place, then in using geothermal instead, that's a power you didn't have to generate in the first place. The second area that we largely used is just straight electric generation. Well, what's happening with that is we're just getting to the place where that's economically marginal in some places. Because ultimately what's happened is Rankine cycle engines, the different dynamos we've used, have gotten better. And you're to a place where these binary cycle can harvest the low heat that you get with the pump rates that you need. And so you can actually start talking about like under a dime a kilowatt hour, which is still a little pricey, but it's at least in the doable range. And the first geothermal plant's going in Texas, like at the moment, down in Starr County. So the thing is then the third is the big one, that if there's going to be a game changer in geothermal, the fundamental thing we came up with is in studying all these sedimentary basins for geothermal, we kind of came to the frustrating conclusion that there are a lot of geothermal reservoirs that are right at that profitability margin. They've got the porosity to pump the water rates we need, and they've got the heat we need, but it's just at the point of competitiveness. But at some point it hits you. What that means is you have a base charge for a battery. You don't have to really heat the rocks up to get them to that margin. So the big idea now is that we could take all that solar, as thermal solar, heat the water before you put it into the ground, and then heat the reservoir, and then extract the water later when you do it. If you can actually get that cycle to work, you can actually get that magic solar baseload that we're after. And you could be, and storage of power on the megawatt scale is really our big problem. Wind and solar are as intermittent, have plenty of energy, but as long as you can't store it, you pretty much have maxed it out. And so there's not really much you can improve on it at this point till you can start storing it in large quantity. So geothermal does have the potential to work as an earth battery, as a storage mechanism. Everybody's got a sedimentary basin, and everybody's got sunshine. And you could theoretically do this, but that said, nobody's tried it yet. So this is sort of a frontier idea. But this is sort of an example of a lot of frontier ideas in green energy. I think one thing I would say about green energy that's important right now that is to appreciate is something I think that's come across throughout much of the discussions through the day. This energy transition, we're not actually in an energy transition. That would imply you are transitioning from a thing to a thing. Right now, we don't have that other thing. What we have is we have a lot of hope. And we have a lot of things that sort of work and are pioneering ideas. But we're looking to really, most of these ideas are like earth battery. They're a thing that they're good ideas, they may work, we may try it, but we don't have them quite yet. So we're looking at something like, the real transition is more like, hey, there's things about a decade or two down the line that we're working on that may eventually work, and then we transition. There's not like, hey, we'll stop using oil and gas right now, and then suddenly we'll use these other things. The math of that just doesn't work.
Thanks for a great panel. I wanted to follow up on the discussion about geothermal because, as I mentioned in my own talk earlier, direct lithium extraction is one of the new technologies that people are promoting. And in California, in the Salton Sea, there's a lot of geothermal activity and some plants, and across the border in Mexico, I think it's the world's largest geothermal complex. Does anybody know if direct lithium extraction technology is really promising, certainly more than the press suggests, and would that make a big difference in the viability of more geothermal plants in these kinds of areas?
Sure, and I've talked to a couple startups. Matter of fact, much of the geothermal is going on right now with startups, and so I'll get calls and do Zoom calls with startups, and that's an idea that comes up a lot. Because with lithium, allow me to put on my geology hat for a moment here. The first thing to appreciate with lithium is that when we start looking at geochemistry, when we learn the fundamentals of it, you get this little diagram that's from Seuss and Urey from the 50s that shows the abundance of elements in the universe. So there's hydrogen, there's helium, there's lithium, beryllium, barium, there's carbon, there's everything else. Lithium is as rare as gold in the universe. It is an extremely rare element. What has been our blessing in that is, unlike gold that just is dispersed, lithium makes some common minerals. So the way lithium actually works is you have some minerals, lepidolite and spodumene being the biggest one, that are not real common minerals that you'll find in mountain belts and so forth. When you weather it and you break it down, lithium washes in, and if you get into hyper-arid regions, like Nevada is the most recent big discovery we made, but the Acoma Desert in Chile is where we get a lot of it, is it will evaporate the water, and the lithium shows up as lithium chlorides, lithium carbonates, lithium hydroxides, but it's salt. And so, yes, In that principle, main way we get lithium now is you put a well here, you put a well here, you pump water through, and you flush the lithium out, and the lithium shows up in the water. So yes, if the lithium happens to be in a place where the ground is sufficiently hot to generate geothermal, you couple these together and you're mining lithium and you're using geothermal energy at the same time. But you're asking for a couple big coincidences, because most of these things, it's the lithium they're after, because it's pretty precious stuff.
15 years ago, we were building LNG to bring it into the country. And now it's the whole dynamic across the world now allowed us to be a big exporter. So aside from maybe increased LNG or maybe a little bit of hydrogen to truly compete with the PRC, like what other opportunities do you see, like in terms of us being able to export over the next decade to really compete with the Belt and Road Initiative?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I would say that we're a demand-driven organization, kind of to the earlier statements. I don't get to say, hey, even if I think it's a really good idea that we should go put an LNG terminal in France, my opinion is uninteresting to anybody that has to do that. However, if the business community, there are opportunities that people see where they think that, hey, look, I think that might actually be a bankable transaction, then absolutely, if we could serve a role to help get it done. I mean, project finance is probably the only way you're going to get it done. And I think that there's ample opportunities to grow on the advantages the United States have, to then build the economic benefits back here in the jobs as well. And one other thing I'll add, it's a very related comment to the lithium comment and some of the other discussions, that one of the things that PRC has been doing, when you can do this when you have very tightly controlled industrial policy, is they have been grabbing up minerals globally, right? They've been, not just the extraction, but really the processing. They're willing to do a lot of the processing where we are not willing to pay the cost with the environmental degradations, et cetera. They don't really have a problem doing that in certain parts of the country. So they have a lock on processing for large numbers of these minerals, et cetera. So there is gonna come a part in time where for a lot of the green transition or the energy transition, we have to have a conversation about the extraction and processing of these kind of rare earths and these kind of other critical minerals, call them the technology minerals if you want. And to that involves questions of project finance for building facilities that can actually do that processing of places it's going to cost.
If I might add to that point just briefly, because the question of lithium comes up a lot. It's important to understand what you're talking about when you're talking about lithium. Remember what I said about it's just rare as gold, but luckily it concentrates in some places where there's a bunch of it and it's easy to get it there. Well, the way that market works is as long as you're not trying to get too much of it from there, it's cheap. But the minute you start using that, the price starts, and the first person doesn't get it, the price skyrockets. So the problem is that with lithium, that's different than petroleum. Remember what I said about, hey, there's like probably 10 trillion barrels of oil in the ground in North America if you could get it and you were willing to pay for it. That's not true of lithium. Lithium, there might only be 100 million kilo, only like 100 million, 100 million tons. Sorry, 100 million tons of that on the planet. I mean, right now, the existing reserves are 20 million tons. But as the price goes up, you can get more. But it's not like petroleum where it's like, oh, there's always more. There isn't. So the problem is if you had literally all the lithium in the world right now, like the 20 million tons of lithium in the world that exists at existing prices, you could make 300 million Teslas. That in the U.S. car fleet is 285 million cars. So you get the picture. The minute you exhaust that, you're paying very large amounts to extract from places that are going to be very hard to extract from. So we have if you're literally going to try to make electric cars with lithium battery technology, you're probably not going to be able to do it.
Hey guys, thank you for bringing up these other newer ideas. You know, there was a time when solar and wind didn't work, and they were the first technologies to be developed, and there was a time when the U.S. was a leader in both solar and wind technology and deployment. It seems to me that the energy transition is as large and impactful as the internet transition, and that fortunes will not be made by the people who say it can't be done. It will not be made by the nations that say it can't be done. From your three perspectives, from business, from research, and from government, what do we need to do to make sure that we are among the people who succeed in this transition?
May I take the first shot at that one? Okay, got it. Just quick. So in other words, I'm a professor, don't talk too long. Right. Okay. All right. Just a quick one is I go back to what I say, I'm optimistic we'll crack this egg. I tell my students I'm turning out to do petroleum, don't expect to do this the rest of your life, but expect to do it for a while. And it's a simple thing, is because I know that we don't have the egg cracked yet. However, I'm optimistic we will do it. It's just I'll say that in the same way that a man in 1950 might say, I'm optimistic we'll walk on the moon. We can't do it now. But I fully think some of these things, the pieces are on the table. I'm optimistic we'll be able to put that together. But I would also say we're going about it completely wrong. Because everything I heard today in this discussion is about financing things that we're doing now that are bit players, that we know will never ultimately solve the problem, but they're things that we know we can sell because people want to buy them, and they're things that we know put a little dent in it, but they don't really get at the problem. The bigger issue we're having right now is we know that this is a basic research question. Our problem isn't will or money, it's thermodynamics. And so we really need to get into hardcore research to address some of these things, and the faster we do that, the faster this happens. And the department, and for all the talk of all the money here, the Department of Energy budget for fundamental research went from $19 billion to $22 billion last year. And NSF is like $9 billion. There's probably not $10 billion coming in fundamental research out of the government to do this, and industry is roughly matching it. But in terms of where you're talking about putting your money to do this, it's like the R&D end of it that actually gets past these. We're really massively underfunding that while we're massively overspending and over-talking about the other things that probably aren't actually going to get to the end game.
Separate from fundamental research, I would add that industry is, I think, taking a lot of meaningful actions in innovation and new technology that will improve the affordability of decarbonization. And just to run through, a quick example, right? I mean, wind turbines continue to get taller and have larger diameter blades. They have blades that are made of advanced materials that are low cost. This last week, I was at a solar panel factory in the United States that is manufacturing solar modules on a roll-to-roll process where they're actually printing them in the same way that newspaper does with advanced materials called perovskites. Batteries have sodium-ion batteries that are 80% as good as lithium-ion today, and they require 0 kilograms of lithium, right? So, there's all kinds of innovations, and fundamental R&D is really important, but industry is leading the way, and that is going to be the solution and the differentiator, I think.
And I'll put a closer on it from a perspective that everybody's going to have their role to play. I don't pretend for 1 second my organization is the sum total solution to all the problems that have been talked about today. But the degree to which I think from the discussions earlier about what the finance community is doing with ESG funds, et cetera, if there is demand that is coming in the transition, both from some of the traditional sources and some of the new sources that we want to see, can we find ways as Americans to work together so we can also pick up wins on the supply side so that the economic benefits of this transition come back here, because others are gunning for it. They think that they're going to make a lot of money on it. They don't have a choice. And I'd rather see that the 21st century come back here than elsewhere.
Just to conclude and tie one last point, having a carbon price is also extremely important. If you think about wind, right? Germany went ahead and subsidized wind. It cost them a lot, and thankfully it did work out. But you are picking a technology, right? And I think the key takeaway from the discussion we just had is we don't really know what that technology is, right? As John said, we're in the infancy. Maybe it's hydrogen, maybe it's geothermal. I mean, I learned a lot, but I don't know which one it will be. Now, when you put a price on carbon, then you let financial markets allocate to what makes most sense, right? When you create tax credits, subsidies for certain sectors, you're trusting that government with only partial information can make that decision for all of us. So I think there's something there, and I think the energy industry broadly should very much be behind, it's either a carbon tax or a carbon compliance market, but that is an essential part. And I'll tell you one last point on why that is necessary. Think about ESG, right? ESG is trillions of dollars that are shifting energy investment. But ESG is an equity instrument. So it takes a 20-year view of the world because it's stock price or discounted cash flow for the next 20 years. Well, that's not what we need in the next 5 years, right? I mean, it's great to have all that solar 20 years from now, but today we can't balance our energy markets. Now, when you put a price on carbon, you're no longer just relying on one financial instrument, equities. You actually are trying to solve a broader energy balance. So I think that's probably the one component I think that is missing in our debate in the U.S. in particular, as it's taboo to talk about a carbon tax. But I think it can do a lot to solve this energy transition. So I'll conclude now. I'd like to thank TCU once again for hosting us. I think this kind of panel, I mean, I learned so much preparing it, and I do energy research as a job. It tells you the importance of academic, financial, and the corporate world. And I think that's the beauty of this program, is to prepare people to look at energy in this broader way. So thanks again.